Thank you, Catherine. I'm so listening to Dr. Cohen's presentation, I'm like, yes, Philly. And it's very exciting because what I'm going to talk about are the things that are left behind in the ground from all of these wonderful historic spaces that we have lost over time. And we're going to run through it very quickly. You're actually going to be spending the day with me because I'm going to take you to Independence, and we are going to see buildings, we're going to see artifacts, and we're going to have a lot of fun. So as I said, I want to talk about the archaeology of Old City, and it's going to be really specific to Independence National Historical Park. And the reason for that is because Independence, and it's a big L, so here's the State House. So our property expands all of this right here. So it's about 46 acres that we manage, and most people think that it's just Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. But we have 46 structures within our property, 17 of which are historic and have either museum installations in them, are used for storage, or are used for offices. So it really is an abundance of the 18th century that we are able to engage with every day. But for archaeology, this is a quick and dirty map of archaeological sites of import around Old City, Philadelphia. There are others, but this is kind of the core sites that have been really revealing in terms of information about the past to us. And so archaeology, it's an interesting thing because the first excavations at Independence National Park actually occurred in 1948 when the legislation was approved by Congress to create the national park. We actually did a dig behind the first bank of the United States, and then from there we were off to the races. Historical archaeology was very fledgling in the 1940s and 1950s, and especially urban archaeology. So I like to think of Independence as the home of urban American archaeology. And, as the science has grown, so have our methods and the way that we look at our data and interpret our information. But we have about 2 million artifacts from our excavations just within our 46 acres that we manage and take care of. So we're going to start at Franklin Court, which you will see today. And Franklin Court was where Benjamin Franklin's big house was. Now, the house was started in 1763. It was totally finished by 1788. Franklin only spent 6 years in the house. After he started construction, he left for London in 1764, did not return until 1775, and then in 1776 he heads to France for another 9 years. So it's really his wife, Deborah, who does not get enough attention, if I may be so bold, who actually managed the construction of the house, managed the family, kept all of the things going here while Ben had some fun abroad. What's actually more interesting to me about Franklin's house is these houses right here, which are called the Market Street houses. And the bulk of the archaeology that we have encountered actually is from the Market Street houses, which you can see down here. Oops, this is the front of them right there. So the court had an evolution. Franklin, over time, began purchasing the Market Street houses because he had an idea of creating this interior court. There were other courts around the city, but Franklin's is probably one of the most significant ones, and it's a very specific design and very well thought out. And there's only one part of Franklin's design that still exists in situ today, which is this right here, which is his carriageway, which is right there. So after Franklin died, his children, we always talk about, we're always asked, well, why did they tear down Benjamin Franklin's house? Because you know why? Because you can cut a street through there and have all of this real estate that you're going to be making money off of. And that is why they tore Ben Franklin's house down. And it was his children who did it. So progress, right? So the court itself is very interesting, and as you can see here, there are many layers because of all of these 19th century buildings. But the first archaeology focused on trying to find Franklin's house. That was the thing. We must find Franklin's house. And so in 1951, they started doing excavations. And it's actually really interesting because there were Park Service archaeologists, but the labor was actually done by a labor union, an African-American labor union here in Philadelphia. And so our first archaeologists at Independence were actually African-Americans who were not trained archaeologists, but they were the ones who were there doing all of the digging. And we've found some of their family who is still living and trying to get oral interviews from them so we can, flesh out that story a little bit more. But anyway, so what they found was the traces of the original foundation walls. This is Franklin's, right here. This is Franklin's privy that had a drain that was connected to the second floor of his house where he had, we'll say he had indoor plumbing, but let's not kid ourselves and think that that meant anything other than somebody had some water and they poured it down the toilet and it flushed everything into the privy. And this privy was dug when the house was expanded in 1786, 87. Later on in 1955, and then especially in the 1970s, prior to the bicentennial, we really dug in, no pun intended, to the Market Street houses and other areas that we had not explored. And so we found the exact placement of Franklin's house, the garden walls, the driveway, the print shop, which is, if you've been to Franklin Court when you see it today, we have ghost structures there to mimic the buildings that were there. So there was a print shop that his son ran just to the north of the house, and then also the Market Street houses. Now, what's super cool, if you really are into this, is that the Market Street houses, so if you've ever read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, you know how he talks about getting off the boat in Philly, walking down Market Street, has buns, bread stuffed in his pockets, and there's a young woman who later becomes Deborah Franklin, who is standing in front of her house. Well, so her house was actually where the Market Street houses are. So she lived in a very early 18th century house, and actually Franklin lived there too. That's how they got to know each other. And so when we did the archaeology of the Market Street houses, which was actually all in the basements, so these are both in basements of the Market Street houses, and we had a dog in the 70s who they swore could find privies because they were, the ground is cooler. And so he would go lay down and they would be like, okay, there's a privy. And sure enough, they usually found them. But the Market Street houses are really interesting because actually there's a lot of material from those that represents the early 18th century, so before about 1720. And that's a lot of information, at least archaeologically, that is missing from the record. So I'm in the pots, and you're going to see a lot of them. So this is just a handful of things that were recovered from the privies behind the Market Street houses. We actually don't have anything relating to Franklin or his occupancy. Those features had been cleaned out. But here you have Dutch tin-glazed earthenware, Staffordshire-style slipwares, this amazing Westerwald mug with that's the cipher of Queen Anne. These two pieces, which you'll actually get to see today and handle, which is really exciting, were made locally here in Philadelphia. So it was just a range of wonderful, wonderful things. But it's not just pots. We have the detritus of the past, ceramics, glass, lots of animal bone because people ate meat and then they discarded them, buttons, thimbles, toothbrushes, hairbrushes, combs, coins, jewelry, toys, the list goes on and on and on. Anything that could be thrown away or dropped into a privy by mistake or on purpose, we encounter those materials. And this is super cool. Does anybody just want to take a guess as what it is? It's a giant tooth of what? So it's actually a mastodon tooth. I know, right? So this was not recovered archaeologically, but it was actually found by a plumber who was doing some work in the Market Street houses. We are fairly certain that this did belong to Franklin. How it got in a basement of a house 100 feet away, I don't know. But we know that, We know that mastodon bones and a mastodon tooth were sent to him from London, and so we're fairly certain that that is it. If you have time to go through the Benjamin Franklin Museum today, you'll be able to see it on exhibit. It's super cool. So moving on, this is actually my favorite site at Independence. It is this monumental piece of 1970s architecture known as the Area F parking deck. And, and there was a wonderful dig that was done there. And what's so interesting about this is that it is a site associated primarily with the waterfront historically. And so Area F, it's right next to, basically right across from City Tavern. And it was the entire block here. And historically, there were two little teensy alleys that cut through there. And you can see here where it was related to the waterfront. And this is what it would have looked like historically. So really tight little alley, about 10 feet wide. Houses on either side, dirty, grimy, good old-fashioned 18th century Philadelphia. However, in the early part of the 18th century, it was where wealthier people lived. And one feature in particular, this one, which was in the basement of a 19th century building that had been built on top of the site, was related to a man named William Annis and his wife Patience, who lived at the site from roughly about 1720 until 1740. I think it's about 1740 when they both died, within the same year. But William Annis is actually really interesting, as is his wife, because we have not only their trash, but we have their wills. We actually have wills from Patient Annis's family where things were passed down to her. And then William Annis himself was a ship captain, and so he traveled all over the world. And he actually was buying books for James Logan, who lived at Stenton. So everything in the 18th century is connected in Philadelphia, including their privies. So just as a highlight of some of the things that were recovered from the Annis privy, and again, it speaks to this greater Atlantic world, which is really fascinating because William Annis was one of the people who was connecting all of those places. And so it's highly likely that some of these things, like this is Portuguese tin-glazed earthenware, this is French Valerius Marmite, I think is what it's called. And then this is wonderful. It's Dutch tin-glazed earthenware, but it is mimicking Wan Li porcelain. French faience, Staffordshire-style slipware, and a whole host of Chinese export porcelain, including this dish here, which you may have seen at Colonial Williamsburg, because Angelica Kutner, the curator there, had reached out to me many years ago because they had one of these and she was trying to prove that they were actually in use in early America. Well, thank you, Mr. Annis, for having two. So, and it's an interesting pattern too because it's a pineapple, nutmeg, and clove. So it's very atypical for 18th century Chinese export porcelain. Also American stuff, this is what I really love. These are locally made red earthenwares, just the pots and pans of the past. And then there was one stoneware pottery that was operating in Philadelphia between 1720 and about 1764, right on Chestnut Street. We'll be right across from it today. And they were making salt glazed stoneware in the style of English and German. It's interesting, the progenitor of that pottery was a man named Anthony Duché, who was a French Huguenot. He came here in 1700. He was the backer for the pottery. His kids were actually the potters. And I don't know who taught them how to make stoneware, though, and that's the really fascinating thing. And I'm hoping, and I've been talking to Rob Hunter, who I'm sure a lot of you know through Ceramics in America, because I'm convinced that William Rogers, the poor potter of Yorktown, may have had something to do with this. But you'll see right here, this is a fleur-de-lis, so a little nod to the Duché's heritage. And you'll get to see some of these today, too. So moving on, we're going to talk about Independence Mall. So here is the State House where we'll be today. So if you've been here before, you know the mall. It's a vast stretch of 3 open blocks that never existed historically. That is what it looks like today, but that's what it used to look like. So here's the State House, and then here is the mall. Now, we don't like to talk about it, but we tore those buildings down because, as Dr. Cohen pointed out, the oldest part of the cities are the first to commercialize. And so by the 1930s, 20s, 30s, 40s, this area had really become industrialized. A lot of people considered it to be a slum. And the national park was established to kind of clean up Old City. And unfortunately, in the process, we really cleaned it up, and we ourselves demolished hundreds of, in the state. You know what? We'll blame it on the state of Pennsylvania. The state tore all these things down. There were hundreds of 18th, 19th, and 20th century buildings lost. Everything from, 18th century houses to a couple of Frankfurt Nest buildings. It was something that we would not do today. But I'm going to talk specifically about where the National Constitution Center building is, which is on the 3rd block of Independence Mall. And we did a huge excavation there between 2000 and 2003 within the footprint of the building. It was the largest archaeological undertaking conducted by the National Park Service. From this site alone, we have over 1 million artifacts. Because think about what Dr. Cohen had showed you with the maps, where if you look at a block, you start seeing all those little lots that were in there. And when you think about those lots, how they change over time, this site began to develop in about the 1760s. It was fully developed by about 1800, and then lots of things changed over time. And so what was really interesting, though, is right here in the center, there had been a natural slump in there in the 18th century. And so we had preserved backyard spaces. And we'll see some pictures of those in a second. But most of the artifacts that we deal with come from our friends' privies. And we had, we call them shaft features because it can be a privy or a well. But we had 139 shafts within our excavation area, and we fully mitigated about 25 of those. So 25 gave us 1 million artifacts. So imagine what we had done if we would have hit all of them. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all full of stuff, but some of them, like this guy here, is literally bursting at the seams with cultural material. And other material, but we'll talk about that later. But here's what's great about them, is because you get to what's called the use layers. And these are the primary deposits of trash, because in addition to being a toilet, privies were also where trash was disposed of. There was no trash guy, that came to your house and took your trash away in the 18th or the 19th century. Even today, it's a roll of the dice if they'll show up. But but you have these wonderful layers within the privies. Sometimes, 70 years worth of trash that's been thrown into these things. And this is the fun stuff that we want to get to. This is one of the backyards I'm talking about. Now, when you were at Stinton yesterday, you're in the country, it's lovely, there's air, there's gardens, there's this. Well, here it's dirty, and because backyards were workspaces, they weren't pleasure spaces. And so you have a tremendous amount of just detritus that makes its way into these sites. And this is actually what's called a midden, so it was literally like a trash heap in your backyard. But they're so cool because that's really where you get to see the life, if you will. It really is, that's the living surface. That's the surface that people walked on. And that, to me, is an incredible way of actually looking at the past. It's very different. We can, in our mind's eye or through documents and through all the records that Dr. Cohen talked about, we can put the house back together. But this is the stuff that shows us what that entire landscape looked like for that house, for that block, and so on and so forth, because everything, it's like a puzzle. Everything fits. This is one part of a larger puzzle that fits into Philadelphia. And what did we find? We found all kinds of cool stuff. This is really just a greatest hits photo. These are my favorite things. But this was a pretty remarkable find. This little glass says Liberty on it. It was from the home of a man named Godfrey Minnick, who was a German baker who had immigrated here in the 1760s. Clearly, he supported the cause. And that's the only one of these that we've ever been able to identify at either above or below ground. Also, lots of, I love china glazed pearlware, can't get enough of it. Lots of creamware. This monumental tureen that actually, this is cool because this is, I mean, the sucker is huge. But it was found in a communal privy with about 115,000 other artifacts that serviced a series of 5 tenement buildings. And this would have been used in one 11 by 15 house that was just 1/1 that had about 13 people living in it. We've done the square footage. It's not good. You're really close to your family. Also, these, I'll just note, this is, I'm not going to be able to remember what the battles are, but these are pearlware luster jugs. And these actually, so Betsy Ross spent the last 4 years of her life at this site. She lived there in a house that had been built in 1775 with her son-in-law and daughter. And we are fairly certain that those were in the home when Betsy was living there. Also, all the little things, the buttons, thimbles, toothbrushes, hairbrushes, combs, coins, jewelry, this is what these things are. Also, like tons of shoes. We see so many shoes. And then just to point them out, these are really, really cool. They're 2 muskets. We have since had them conserved, and they're in rough shape. But we have a house, actually the same house that Betsy lived in when it was first built. It was built by a man named Caleb Cresson, who was in the Quaker leadership. And his home was occupied by the British during the occupation of Philadelphia. And so with these muskets, we also found a whole bunch, like hundreds and hundreds of musket balls, but also bayonets, swords, knives, other things, even a couple of buttons telling us what the battalion was that was there. And having a moment in time captured. And we don't know like how those things made their way in there. Also, somebody had broken them. They had basically like baseball batted them to break the locks out. So the locks are gone because those could be recycled and be reused. So somebody had made the guns unusable and then tossed them. Also paper. Now, I'm going to say this was probably toilet paper. And yes, that's my hand. It's okay. I have since washed it. But it's really great to have such preservation because at the bottom of these privies, you have what's called an anaerobic environment, and that is a semi-liquid because, of course, you're getting into the water table, and then there's all that other stuff filtering down. But there's a high rate of organic preservation because bacteria can't grow in those environments. So we have readable 18th century newspaper, which I was able to finally, took me about 7 years to find it, but I was able to find Benjamin Morris's at his wine and bottling store, the best pickling vinegar. So, so this was from 1790, and we have so much stuff. All right, I got 1 minute. We're going to blast through the West Shipyard. We're going to leave Independence because this is super cool, and you guys need to know about it. This is the West Shipyard, which is actually up Columbus Boulevard. There is a little bit of it. There's a little bit that survives here. So I-95 runs right here. So we made the brilliant decision in the 1950s to put an interstate through our waterfront, which was the oldest part of the city. And, and they wiped it out. And there's only one little surviving part. This is one of the Breton prints showing this little bit of the West Shipyard. This is the Penny Pot Tavern, which is famous in Philadelphia history. And this is essentially what's called Water Street, which is now gone thanks to I-95. And if you're from Philadelphia, and if you're not, you should go up there and see it. This is actually the last surviving stairs that took you down to the waterfront. So Philadelphia originally had a high bank at Front Street, and you had to walk down to the waterfront. And these are the Wood Street stairs. They survive. Again, there's one little tiny block of front and water that survives, but there were dozens, well, about a dozen, I think, of these steps that went down to the waterfront, and you can see more examples here. And if you look at the maps, you can see them going down, but that was the way you accessed the waterfront. And that's where these steps are. So here they are, build 95. Yay, let's destroy everything. And then, so this is a little bit of Front Street, Water Street, and then this is the West Shipyard. It's a parking lot now. Actually, it's getting ready to be a condominium. But there was an archaeological dig there in the early 1980s that discovered that there was a lot preserved underneath that parking lot there because it's partially waterlogged. So this is a 18th century ship's way. And it's hard to see because this is the only picture, but the shipway here is right here. And so we know that part of the shipyard still survived under there. Last year, there was a dig there. The people who were building the condo actually agreed to do archaeology, which is a shocker. Nobody wants to do archaeology. But they don't. It's so expensive. But anyway. But what's really cool about this is it shows you how that land was filled in. So Water Street was Water Street because it was on the water. It was the shoreline. So this is surviving piece of cribbing. And what they would do, think of Lincoln logs, and build a box of Lincoln logs. And then you put some trash in it. Then you put some more logs, put some more trash in it, and slowly that starts to fill in your landscape. And all of this is this cribbing that is now the ground surface. And seeing it preserved was just amazing. But here you see the logs. And I mean, they're perfect. They were perfect. And what's neat here is if you can see it. So 18th century cribbing, this little bit right here, 18th century floor, this brick, 19th century factory building, and then right up here, a wooden floor from the early 20th century. That's pretty righteous, right? But seeing that in situ and being able to see also how the city was developed. So archaeology isn't just about the people who lived in the past, looking at the objects they left behind and putting a story together about them. It's also about putting together the story of Philadelphia. And it's so unfortunate that the waterfront has been so destroyed because it would just be wonderful to see all of that. So to close, as you walk around today, as we're moving through Old City in the rain, it is not always sunny here, but it is a remarkable place. I'm a Virginian by birth. I always thought I would go back to Virginia, and then I moved to Philly, and I am home. It's a wonderful place with wonderful history. But as you walk around, as you see all of these spaces, remember, you might just not know what's beneath your feet. So, thank you so much.